Hi everyone, my name is Dave, and welcome to Extra Credit, a video series where we take an unscripted look at topics related to local history and exploring that history. All right, as we normally do at the start of every episode, just a quick reminder to visit my website. You'll find a link in the description. There you'll find all kinds of content related to the topics we take a look at in this video series and then some, including a section for extra credit. So if you're new to extra credit, if you're new to these videos, or if you've missed previous episodes, or if you just want to go back and take a look at things that we've done in the past, there you're going to find a link to all of the topics that we've covered in this particular series. Additionally, please remember to follow me on social media. So you'll find me on Facebook, you'll find me on Twitter or X, and you'll find me on Instagram. And last but not least, if you haven't already done so, please make sure that you subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications. There's quite a bit of content that posts, fairly regularly on here. Particularly at certain times of the year, particularly in the spring and the fall when we're out actively hiking. And usually there's a delay, by the time when it's produced, and then when it's posted, and then when it finally gets onto social media. So, if you're just following me on social media, oftentimes you're not going to get the content right away. There's going to be a bit of a lag between when it shows up on YouTube and then when it gets onto social media. So by subscribing, turning on the notifications, you're going to get that information and those posts just as soon as they come out. All right. So, beautiful day, beautiful morning here at camp. Unfortunately, the black flies are out. They're kind of buzzing around, which is not cool, but it is what it is. It is a very beautiful morning. We haven't had too many like this as of late. It's very, very calm on the lake, so which is why I decided to sort of come outside and do this episode. But you will see lots of bugs zipping around on the screen. So as you saw by the title of today's episode, today what we're going to be doing is taking a look at something that we haven't yet talked about, maybe kind of alluded to a little bit, but not talked about directly, which is the Pigeon River Lumber Company. Now, in case you're wondering, why is somebody like me, who's kind of a bit of a railway historian, talking about a lumber company? Well, basically, the reason why is that it ties into a lot of the history that I've been researching over a long period of time. Just swallowed a bug. So, basically, part of the history of this lumber company revolves around the Port Arthur, Duluth and Western Railway. And this lumber company was actually one of the big reasons why the Port Arthur, Duluth and Western, the PD, experienced a bit of a kind of a renaissance, or a big sort of bump during the early part of the 1900s. The lumber company actually had a lumbering operation towards the end of the PD line on Gunflint Lake, and they actually built a logging railroad called the Gunflint and Lake Superior. And again, that sort of ties in with the history of the PD. So where did I first started hearing a little bit about this? Well, when I first started researching the PD, one of some of the earliest things that I read about it, particularly, its history on places like Gunflint Lake, is I actually read a couple articles that were written by a very, very well-known resident of Gunflint Lake by the name of Justine Kerfoot. Justine Kerfoot is basically a bit of a legend in that part of northern Minnesota. So she first came to Gunflint Lake in the 1920s when her parents had purchased what would become the Gunflint Lodge. And so basically she spent her entire life in the area, raising a family, exploring, guiding, running the lodge. And so she became very, very synonymous. She wrote numerous books about her experiences in the area, and she did write numerous articles as well. And in those articles, basically, she described some of the history of the railway line in the area. And in particular, she talked about this sort of railway line that ran down the eastern side of the lake. And, she described some of the features of this railway line. And I sort of found it very, very intriguing. And so eventually I figured out that this had nothing to do with the PD, that this was actually a separate entity, that this was a logging line that was owned by the Pigeon River Lumber Company. So in 1997, I made a trip to the area. I spent a bunch of days staying with friends of the family on North Lake, and so I did travel made numerous trips to Gunflint Lake by boat, and I did explore parts of the Gunflint and Lake Superior. And so it really kind of got me interested in it because there were some really neat features. You could see some of the remains of the railway line, in particular the big corduroy trestle that ran beside Bridal Falls. Um, and so it was kind of always at the sort of the back of my mind. And we kind of talked about this in a previous episode. Was in 2013, I wrote my first article for the Thunder Bay Museum. They have an annual publication called Papers and Records. And so I had written an article about Lee Blaine. The bugs are really bad out here. And so what I decided to do was, once I had done that, I said, maybe I should write another one of these. And I said, maybe this logging line, maybe this Gunflint and Lake Superior Railroad would be a great topic to write about. And as I started kind of researching for the article, it became very apparent. There's Looney coming, running. The bugs are probably bugging you, eh? It became very apparent that there was more information here that that could fit into an article, and it's very quickly blew up into a book. And I believe in our last episode, so when I was talking about 30 years of doing this, this history work, that I talked about sort of writing this book. So I don't want to get too much into the details of that, but I do want to talk a little bit about this logging company and sort of its impact on the history of the area. So the Pigeon River Lumber Company, there are a lot of people in the area that are familiar with the company. Maybe not about all the details, but basically they kind of know that, given its name, that the Pigeon River Lumber Company was logging along the Pigeon River, which basically forms the border between Ontario and Minnesota. And so from my research, essentially I've been able to kind of track the history of this company and kind of when everything kind of got started. So the history of the company actually predates their logging operation by quite a number of years. And so the interest in this particular area began in about 1897 or so. And so it's interesting in the sense because it ties in with a lot of places. Obviously, it ties in with the history of this area. It ties in with some Minnesota history, and it also ties in with Wisconsin history as well, because the individuals that were involved in this company originally came from Wisconsin. And so basically the story begins with two individuals. You have a guy by the name of Daniel J. Arpin, who hailed from a place called Grand Rapids, Wisconsin. And today Grand Rapids is called Wisconsin Rapids. I think they changed the name because there was probably confusion between Grand Rapids, Wisconsin and Grand Rapids, Michigan. And so Arpin's family had originally hailed from Quebec, and they had his family had come to Wisconsin in the mid 1800s to capitalize on the logging industry that was booming in there at the time. And so he came from a very large, kind of very well-known sort of logging family. And one of the acquaintances, one of his, I guess, friends, you could say, from that particular time was a guy by the name of, the bugs are killing me here, by the name of William Scott. And so Scott actually, a lot of people in the area are very familiar with Scott, and I'll kind of talk a little bit about that. So these two individuals who had basically been friends for a long period of time began basically, working together in the logging industry. And Scott himself had, some very big ties with the logging industry as well. His uncle was a very prominent logger in Wisconsin, and so. The story is very convoluted and it's very difficult to tell in a short little video here, but basically there was an interest in the timber stands that were along the boundary waters between Ontario and Minnesota, and Arpin and Scott were not the only ones that were interested. There was another outfit that hailed from Michigan called the Alger-Smith Company, and some people are familiar with Alger-Smith. And so they had been logging in Michigan, and then they decided to kind of uproot their whole operation and move it to Minnesota. And so again, a lot of the preliminary work was being done in the sort of the late 1800s. And eventually what ended up happening was, companies were formed, the Pigeon River Lumber Company being formed in 1900. But prior to that, there were some companies that were formed to basically to facilitate the logging that was going to happen, right? The Pigeon River is not particularly easy to log along because they were going to use the river to float the logs, and they had to build some infrastructure on the river. And that building of that infrastructure actually dated back to the early 1900s. And again, it's a very complicated story for me to try to tell in a very, very short period of time. You'll have to read my book when it comes out. Anyway, so basically all of this infrastructure gets built on the Pigeon River and its tributaries. Basically Alger-Smith starts to log. The Pigeon River Lumber Company is formed in the summer of 1900. And so you basically have Arpin, you have Scott, and they bring on board another Wisconsin lumberman by the name of Herman Finger. He has kind of a whole sort of backstory himself. I'm not sure. What I don't know, and I was never able to sort of definitively, determine it with regard to the book, was how Arpin and Scott kind of got connected to Finger. But in any case, they were able to basically form this company. Now, I think they were still kind of looking for more help, more investment with this. And so there was a connection between Arpin and Scott and another very prominent Wisconsin lumberman by the name of Frank Hickson. And Hickson was probably one of the most prominent lumbermen in Wisconsin at the time. And so from correspondence, they were trying to bring him on board even prior to the company being formed, even like when they were still doing a lot of the preliminary work. And so I guess, going back and forth, and they were finally able to convince him. So he kind of joined the consortium after the, you can hear a loon. They joined the consortium after the company was formed. And so basically the company set up shop in what is now Thunder Bay. And so again, you kind of have this really weird sort of scenario where you have this Wisconsin company, all these Wisconsin lumbermen operating a company in Ontario. And there was a reason for that, because basically in Ontario had passed a law just a few years prior, and actually it ties in with the other company that was working the logging limits, the Alger-Smith Company. What they were doing was, particularly in the area around Lake Huron, is they were cutting logs on the Ontario side and rafting them across Lake Huron and then cutting them in Michigan. So the not the Canadian government, the Ontario government didn't like that, so they passed a law basically saying that any logs cut on Crown land, so basically that was owned by the people of Ontario, had to be processed in Ontario. Now there were a few little lumber sections that were exempt from that, and two of them belonged to Alger-Smith. So what Alger-Smith was doing is they were cutting on the Pigeon River and then towing them to their mill in Duluth. But everybody else had to follow the law. So the Pigeon River Lumber Company had to basically process their logs in Ontario. So they had to set up a mill in what is now Thunder Bay. And so what they did was they purchased a sawmill belonging to a couple of individuals named Graham and Horn, and that was located in the then city of Fort William. And so they set up this mill, and they kind of got it going, and they were trying to get their operation going, and they were, the bugs are driving Luna crazy too. And so things started getting rolling. Where it ties into my particular interest in this was in 1902, the company was able to acquire some timber limits near Gunflint Lake. So the geography of this area doesn't really lend itself for certain species of trees to grow, particularly the big species they were cutting back at that time, which is white pine. And there were only certain pockets of white pine in the area. So there were some pockets of white pine closer to the border with Minnesota on the Ontario side. And then there were some pockets along Gunflint Lake. And so again, now that they were able to acquire these tracts of land at Gunflint, and there's a whole backstory to that as well, because they had been offered for sale prior to prior to 1902, and the company kind of balked at the price, and eventually they did acquire these lands, and so beginning in 1902 they began a logging operation at Gunflint Lake, and a lot of people aren't aware of this. People who know about the Pigeon River Lumber Company are probably familiar with the logging that they did along the Pigeon River closer to Lake Superior, but they're not familiar that there was a logging operation at Gunflint Lake. And so the logging operation went on for 7 years, from 1902 to 1909. And there was a couple years there that the Gunflint operation was actually the biggest operation that the Pigeon River Lumber Company had going. They were cutting more logs at Gunflint than anywhere else. But by 1909, essentially all the profitable white pine had been cut, and they decided to sort of wrap up the operation. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in some subsequent episodes, and talk a little bit more about some of the some of the specifics. And we'll go down and visit probably the Pigeon River, and there's some vestiges of their logging operation there. You can see the remains of some of the dams that they did, and then there was a log chute that they had built to basically bypass a set of falls called High Falls, and you can see remnants of that. Log chute. So after the closure of the Gunflint operation, she's back. Hi. After the closure of the Gunflint operation, the company continued to operate. Eventually, they basically became a Canadian company, because they were essentially for a long time a Wisconsin company operating in Canada, but they became chartered in Canada, and they continued to operate until the early 1920s. And basically by that time, all of the profitable white pine had been cut along the Pigeon River, and so that sort of began to sort of dwindle. And as that happened, the company started to sort of wind down their operation. Finger had left very early on in the operation, so he had kind of moved on. I've never been able to kind of trace why he did that. I know there was a bit of animosity developed between him and Scott, and so there could have been some sort of personal kind of clashes that happened. Finger actually moved on to Manitoba, and he opened a logging operation in the northern part of the province of the Pas, and he actually became the first mayor of the city of the Pas. So he's got a tie-in with that particular area. And so eventually what ended up happening was the company ended up sort of wrapping up their operation. They closed their sawmill. They were still sort of selling lumber. Eventually people began to sort of drop out. So Scott ended up kind of going on his own and basically creating his own lumber company, which became known as the Scott Lumber Company. Scott, as I mentioned, kind of is very well known in the Thunder Bay area, because in the around about 1917 or so, he was one of the major people involved with the building of a highway between Fort William and Port Arthur and Duluth, and then the subsequent bridge that was built over the Pigeon River, which didn't really have official permission to be built and became known as the Outlaw Bridge. And so you'll probably still find some folks, some folks here in Thunder Bay that are a little bit more, some elders that call the highway, which is technically Highway 61, they still call it the Scott Highway. And I remember in my younger years, lots of people kind of refer to it as the Scott Highway after William Scott. And so basically after that, the Pigeon River Lumber Company kind of faded into history. But I mean, it was my God, the bugs are like crazy here. They're just sort of swarming around. They were huge for the history of the area. If you take a look at the city of Port Arthur, so initially the Pigeon River Lumber Company had their sawmill in Fort William at that Graham and Horn site, but they eventually built their own sawmill. Um, Swallowed another one. Built their own sawmill by 1903, and at the time it was one of the biggest and most modern sawmills in Canada. And until 1911, when the Port Arthur Shipbuilding Company was created, the Pigeon River Lumber Company was the biggest employer in the area. Right, between the sawmill and between their their bush operations, they were employing hundreds of people, right? So this company was a huge part of the development, in terms of the history of the city of Thunder Bay. And so you can't sort of understate the importance of this particular company. And again, there's a lot of different facets to the company itself, right? Again, there's the sawmill that was in Thunder Bay, and what was being done there, the lumber that was being produced for the local market, but a lot of it was sent out to Western Canada, right? So the markets in Winnipeg and sort of the growing markets in places like Saskatchewan and things like that. There was some of it was exported to the United States, and then you have the whole aspect of the wood operations, right? The cutting that was happening at the Pigeon River, the cutting that was happening at Gunflint Lake, right? So a very, very important company and a very important part of the history of this particular area. And so what we're going to be doing in subsequent episodes is we are going to be exploring a little bit more of the history of this particular company. Like I said, we are going to kind of delve into the operations that they had down by the Pigeon River, and we're going to dive into the operations that they had at Gunflint Lake, which is the area that I'm kind of interested in. And so hopefully through these episodes we can basically expand people's knowledge of this very, very important company and how it ties in with for example, the rail history of this particular area, with the Pee Dee and all the business that it generated from that, all of the and at the time the Pee Dee was controlled by the Canadian Northern Railway. And there's, oh my God, there's like, when I was researching for the book, there was so much interaction between the Pigeon River Lumber and Canadian Northern, right? Trying to get upgrades done to the line and, rates for hauling logs. And, there's just this constant back and forth between the two companies. But, there's a very famous line that was penned by a historian by the name of J.P. Bertrand. Bertrand basically worked for the Pigeon River Lumber Company, and so he wrote a lot about the history of the area, and he had written a manuscript for a book called Timberwolves, and it never got published before, and it was never published before he died because he didn't necessarily talk very flatteringly about some of the big sort of timber heavyweights in the area. And so the manuscript was kind of kicking around until the 1990s. And then what ended up happening was the Thunder Bay Museum decided to basically edit the manuscript and publish it. And so now you can purchase a copy of his book, the Timberwolves. And in the book, he makes a very interesting point about the Pee Dee, both the Port Arthur, Duluth and Western. And he says that it is, I think the quote went something like, "It is very doubtful that any small railway or any branch line like the Pee Dee," the dog just bumped the camera. It is doubtful that any small little line like the Pee Dee hauled so much, lumber products or basically timber products, right? He talked about things like saw logs, and he mentioned ties, and he mentioned pilings and pulpwood and things like that. And so this line was hugely important for the city. It was hugely important for the rail history, and certainly hugely important for the people of the area. Okay, So, lest I get driven crazy here by the bugs, and the bugs are driving the dog crazy as well. So we're going to wrap up this episode here. And so, like I said, we're going to be back with more episodes about the Pigeon River Lumber Company, and hopefully we'll get out in the field, and we're actually going to see some of these locations, and be able to sort of talk about them a little bit more. But in the meantime, thanks for tuning in. And again, we're going to be back with some more non-Pigeon River Lumber Company episodes coming up next month. And so make sure you stay tuned for those. And thanks for tuning in, and take care.